What we're seeing played out in this particular conflict is the use of especially drones, not only in terms of reconnaissance in determining and ascertaining enemy positions and fortifications, which could then be exploited or targeted by your traditional physical troops and ordnance, but also where drones have been used to deploy and discharge improvised explosive devices, grenades, and various other ordnance directly into enemy positions on convoys, on trenches, and various other types, which evidently minimizes or certainly reduces the number of physical casualties that could be sustained on the battlefield. What we are also seeing is these non-kinetic weapons which are being deployed, especially lasers or directional force weapons, which again are very, very effective, certainly at intercepting ballistic missiles, sometimes many kilometers away or certainly many kilometers at height, which are again very low cost in terms of their application. When you look at the many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that would need to be invested on each ballistic missile that is actually deployed. So where we're seeing an interesting dynamic is in low cost but high tech weaponry being discharged to intercept high cost ballistic missiles, which could have economic impact on Russia in trying to deploy these types of weapons, because they'll be wasting millions of dollars on something which is relatively cheap to intercept. When you do have a conflict like Ukraine, where the media will continually publish and publicize, obviously, what is going on, this becomes an ideal testing ground for many of the weapons development companies in trialing new technology and showing what can be used in a very practical sense that could be again applied in other conflicts in the future or within the defense or offense capabilities by various other countries across the world. So in some regards, it's almost a publicity event to promote their new products. But at the same time, it also provides that R&D, that research and development, to see how they can refine that technology. And where we're seeing lasers being applied, this could, as we're seeing, advance the capabilities in both defense and offense to minimize the numbers of physical humans needing to be at the front line of these conflicts. In terms of the limitations of non-kinetic weapons, such as lasers, there are very few limitations which are ultimately in place or could be explored. Ultimately, any weapon that is trialed or tested on the battlefield has to obviously have certain mitigation measures to ensure that those that are deploying those weapons cannot suffer from things like radiation or technical failure, which could have disastrous effects or potentially incur injuries. However, directional weapons like lasers can be utilized at very, very low cost. And as we know, their capabilities could be very extensive depending on what their intended purpose might be. The use of these kind of futuristic directional weapons like lasers could alter and change how battles are waged in the future. They could also be utilized in a very positive and proactive sense in dissuading an enemy to engage in combat or conflict in the first place, as the ultimate results to that force could be hugely detrimental and have massive implications in terms of the publicity, which is really key in any conflict as to who is winning that conflict or winning that war, if you like. So we could see the possible removal of what we would call fighting forces in a very conventional sense, i.e. soldiers armed with weapons on the battlefield conducting warfare. And we could see more of a arm's reach, long distance ability to certainly take over an opposing offensive physical force by using these laser guided weapons or laser directional weapons. In terms of the utilization of laser weapons, could this potentially create or antagonize an opposing force more? It really depends on how those laser weapons are applied. and to what significant effect it will have on enemy positions, for example. There will need to be compliance to certain rules of engagement. There will need to be compliance to the Geneva Convention, although there have been already many examples where the Geneva Convention has been contravened by both Ukrainian and Russian troops in this particular conflict. But should these weapons, these laser weapons, non-kinetic weapons in their purest sense, cause irreparable harm, remove the aspect or element of taking prisoners of war, which in itself can be used as leverage at minimizing or reducing certainly conflict, that then brings its own interesting dynamics as to whether that is the sole direction that conflict should go towards, or whether you still will need to have combatants on the battlefield. The rollout of these weapons, as we're seeing, is incredibly fast. The use of drones and the development of these drones, even from what we've seen on social media, has advanced significantly from those that we purely used for reconnaissance purposes to those that have been used directly as a weapon against opposing forces, and the various applications that they've been utilized, including those that have discharged what one could only call as napalm from a quadcopter which is flying over an enemy position that may be well dug in or even concealed within foliage and forestry. There are a number of companies that I know of that are not based within Ukraine that have contributed this technology for the purposes, as we've mentioned, of research and development and trying to refine this technology itself. Whether it requires the United States involvement, well, much of this will be down to the acquisition of these weaponries, and very many of these companies will not simply provide them free of charge. And their utilization may be successful, partially successful. Again, this is part of the trial and error process. So the United States could still be necessary in terms of the financing. But whether the US decides to actually finance it directly or not is an entirely different matter. Certainly, as we've seen quite recently from President Trump's position in the response to President Zelensky's denial or removal of the agreement on mineral rights, which ultimately sets a very dangerous precedent for all other international countries that are investing or contributing money to the Zelensky and the Ukraine war effort, because the mineral rights would have served as a good repayment structure to the United States for their considerable investment. One particularly interesting development is the interceptor drone that Ukraine has introduced into this conflict, which is the most effective intercept to Russia's preferred and well-supplied and well-resourced ballistic missile that they are looking to send in. But again, it comes down to the numbers and capability that Ukraine will sustain, and also the numbers of ballistic missiles that Russia may choose to send into Ukraine. And again, it will be a constant battle of who will have the upper hand. But this drone certainly will be a far cheaper option. And for Russia, each time they deploy one of these ballistic missiles, it's costing them many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars every time they do.